Okay, as I see there are less people joining, we can start the session. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the training session on project monitoring and evaluation. My name is Eike Hinrichsen, and together with my colleague Matheus Pereira, we will guide you through the session on the training session. But before we start with the actual training, I would like to remind you of some housekeeping rules, as we're many people in this virtual room. We would ask you to turn your camera and your microphone off during the whole training session so that we can follow the presentations of the speakers easily. However, we encourage you to put your questions in the chat so that we can consider them in the end in the Q&A session. The training on monitoring and evaluation is the third and last of a training session series organized by the Conflicts and Disasters branch of the United Nations Environment Programme. And the aim of this series was and is to share experience and lessons learned with project managers from all over the world.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. And yeah, as I said, the aim is to share lessons learned because as a branch and external expert working with the branch, we have much experience in the field of disaster management. And this training is not intended to make you fully trained project managers during emergencies, because that's impossible in 90 minutes, but it's rather to give you insights in how to deal and, more importantly, how to prepare to unexpected events. So if you are also interested in watching the previous training sessions on project management, on project planning and on project implementation, you can do so. We will share, or my colleague will share the link to these sessions in the chat. And there you can find the recordings and also the presentations of the speakers from these sessions. Today's session will be structured similar to the previous one. So we will hear first 2 presentations, and then we will have a Q&A session of about 30 minutes in the end. And the 2 experts we invited for today are Ravishankar and Atila Uras. And the first presentation will be given by Ravi, who will present some concepts about monitoring and evaluation. And in the second part, Attila will then share his experience with monitoring and evaluation in project management during emergencies. So let me just shortly introduce our first speaker. Ravi is a senior project advisor at UNEP, and he is an environmental engineer based in Canada, and he has over 30 years experience on project management projects around the world to help organizations and individuals strengthen their environmental and safety management capacities. Ravi is a former director in the Canadian nuclear sector and has extensive experience in regulatory compliance and oversight of environmental protection activities. As advisor at UNEP, Ravi has worked on projects in many countries, including Nigeria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Uganda, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, India, and Haiti. And recently, Ravi was engaged in helping member states to incorporate environmental linkages in the COVID-19 related recovery needs assessment, as well as in developing and delivering a series of remote training programs on COVID-19 related waste management. So that's for Ravi, and without further ado, I would like to give you the floor. Please start sharing your presentation, and we're excited for your presentation.
Thank you. It says here you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. So if you can take that off, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so then I have to, okay. All right, how am I sharing? Almost there. Is that good?
Yes, we can now see your screen, but not in the presentation mode yet.
Correct, in the presentation mode. This would be good. So show presenters view, and I'm going to the first slide first.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Officially, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm here in Ottawa sunny but cold. I'm excited about this particular presentation, and even more so to listen to the second part of this training with all the experiences that Attila will bring. So let's move on without further delays. The purpose of my presentation today is to set the stage for Attila's presentation. So I want to cover the basics on monitoring and evaluation. This is just an overview because M&E, the monitoring and evaluation concept, is a vast topic. So what I have done is providing you with the overview, but towards the end of the presentation, I have provided several useful links for free tools and guidances. So anyone who wants to take on monitoring and evaluation of projects in the future, you could use those links. You could to learn or to use the tools in order to implement in your programs and projects. So that's because I know that a lot of you have got some experience in project management, so not all these concepts are brand new for you. And I also know that a few of you, or at least that I know, are PMPs. So this definitely is something that is well within your domain. So let me go with why is M&E process important and why are we covering this? It's because the monitoring and evaluation process is part of a systematic approach to the results-based management of projects and programs. It is meant to measure progress of programs or projects and their impacts. It helps to demonstrate project success or sometimes catch challenges early so we can adapt them. And it also helps identify all elements and cross-cutting issues too, because when you're planning, sometimes it may not be obvious to the project managers on some of the cross-cutting aspects or some other elements that may be important, either because it is important for the overall project priority, or it is a demand by the donor, or any of those kinds of things. So it's important to cover all of those. And what the M&E process does is it helps. Bottom line is, if we don't plan a project properly, and if we don't put things in place in order to measure our success, then it is quite possible that practical experience tells us that it's quite possible that the project will veer off. There is scope creep, all kinds of challenges. So that's why I've put this good expression that some of you may be familiar with. If you don't know where you're going, you will end up someplace else. And that is from Yogi Berra. So going to the next slide. So let's, instead of talking about various concepts in an amorphous manner, let's take a look at a project or a program. So what happens if you are someplace and there is an intervention, basically a need for a project or a program? It could be because there has been flooding and that needs to be fixed, or there is major slope stabilization that is required in a mountainous area so that people down below are going to be safer, or even a contaminated land from oil spill that needs to be cleaned up. You take any program or a project, you have a need that is identified, and then you have to find a donor for the funding source. And so you need to prepare a concept note, you go talk to that person or the organization. Once you have the initial feel, you prepare a more detailed proposal. That proposal gets approved, and then comes the project design stage. And the project design is where all the details come in, M&E comes in, a log frame, and all some of the terms I'm going to talk later. And then you implement the project. And the implementation of the project has got multiple things. You have to build a team, you have to put quality controls in place, you have to initiate the project, you have to cost, budget, scope, schedule, procurement, all kinds of elements are there which you are familiar with from a project management perspective. And so all these elements are there, and M&E is required in all of these aspects so that it's really well planned ahead of time, but it is also planned in such a manner that it is flexible so that as the project progresses, it is it is adaptable to the new realities of the project as it proceeds. So that's a typical life of a program, and that's where I want to underline here that the monitoring and evaluation component is in all of these aspects. So what's the difference between a project and a program? A project is chartered to create a specified deliverable as efficiently as possible. A single deliverable, for example, a single identified deliverable. Programs, on the other hand, could be the coordination of a number of related projects and other activities, and it could span over time. It could span a number of years, and it could span multiple countries and regions, communities, all those. So program is a combination of all these various projects that are interrelated and together. So what happens is with the monitoring and evaluation side of things, the scope of M&E is much larger and at more strategic level, at a higher level for a program compared to a project. So again, monitoring and evaluation are two distinct sets of organizational activities. Monitoring is the systematic collection and analysis of information as a project progresses. Okay, so that is for a single project. Evaluation is the comparison of how the project impact is the actual project impact compared to what was originally envisaged or committed to in the proposal or the project design. So it is the measurement of project impact versus the monitoring side, which is the measurement of project progress. So, and the evaluation sometimes also, right in the beginning of the project, you would decide how frequently you would do an evaluation. In other words, it could be an interim evaluation halfway through the project, or if it's a very long project, a certain period of time on a periodic basis, you would do the evaluation so that you have the checks and balances in terms of the impact of the project. So this pictorial basically shows, you get the idea. You have the plan of a program or a project, you implement it, you monitor during this process, you reflect, you adjust, you implement, continue to implement, you monitor, and then lessons learned, implement, and then ultimately evaluate. So that's basically what this pictorial is showing. Now, UN Evaluation Office website has got a really nice pictorial, and that's where I got this from. The evaluation component is basically, whoever has been hired to do the evaluation. First, the contract has to be put in place, and then there is a there is a preparatory side of things. You start the project, the evaluation project, you look at all the information that is available to you, desktop review, all of that, and you prepare for the field mission. Then you go to the field, take a look at what's been happening, whether the promise of what's on paper is actually in the field. So you do a verification of that. And then you come back, you write the report based on everything that you have gathered, compared to the baseline, what in the beginning of the project, how the project has done. And then you provide a draft report to your project managers or program managers. And there is going to be a consultation period back and forth, and you disposition all the comments that come from these draft reviews and consultations, and then you finalize. And then after that, there is a certain follow-up that the program managers will commit to based on all the things that have been found during the evaluation. So, you start off, you do the review, desktop review, you do the field mission, you complete the report, you submit the report, and then you follow up. So the concepts, some of the concepts and terms that are used in M&E. The first one I want to delve a little bit deeper is the theory of change. This is something that in the normal jargon, people don't talk. It's a very specific M&E jargon, the phrase. It is, the pictorial that is shown here is it sort of provides an idea. Basically, if you have an intervention or a project, for example, and you have identified several different outputs from that particular project, right? And I'll tell you what an output is in the next slide. Once the output happens, then the resulting outcome comes. So let me go to the next slide first and talk about output and outcome first, and then come back. The output is the result of a program or intervention activities in the form of deliverables. So if you are out there to clean up a contaminated site, the deliverable is the cleaned up site. Outcome is the short-term and medium-term effect of an intervention of a project outputs, such as change in knowledge, attitude, beliefs, behaviors, ground conditions, etc. Milestones are the timeline markers throughout the project, and this particular at specific times, and these are identified ahead of time during the project design. And these are checkpoints that identify when those certain activities are supposed to be completed. So if you're taking the contaminated sites project example, if you are going to clean up a site, then it just doesn't happen itself. You have to first do the procurement, you have to get all the contractors lined up, you have to have all the information in place, and you have to allow them to do the work, and then you have to go check. So these are all various checkpoints, and procurement may need 5 months to happen. So you have a milestone after 5 months, and you check how the procurement is doing. If the procurement is delayed, then we already know that the project is going to get delayed, right? So that's why these milestones are important. So coming back to the theory of change, when you have an output, you have these deliverables, and outcome is something that is medium to long-term or short-term to medium-term impact because of your project. Then how is that going to have a long-term impact on the area? So if it is contaminated sites project, you are looking at once the cleanup is done, then that area can be reclaimed, and that area can be rehabilitated. Maybe a park can be built, maybe houses can be built, all kinds of long-term impact can happen. But from the outcome to the long-term impact, there are several different states that happen. And what theory of change does is it links how the outcome to the impact happens. It's a pathway, it's like a road. And that road, there are two aspects here. One is there are certain assumptions that you make. And the assumptions are that, the place is going to continue to be clean, that it's not going to be recontaminated. The area is going to be peaceful. There's not going to be a war. Those kinds of assumptions that you're going to make. And then there are drivers. Drivers means things that governments or communities can do to push this forward. Governments can allow for new houses to be built, and on previously contaminated land, they have to do certain things. Those are drivers. So actions are drivers, assumptions are our assumptions that certain things don't happen or negative things don't happen in order for this pathway to happen. So this is a really interesting concept, and this is a concept that is very heavily used in our proposal writing and prepare a log frame and M&E. So I recommend that you look into it further. The log frame is the planning tool that is part of the project design. It consists of a matrix which provides an overview of the project's goal, activities, anticipated results, milestones, everything. That is all outlined, and that is the log frame. So we went through what the milestones and outputs are. Now, what are components of an M&E plan? Basically, it's a document, and there is a template for that I have provided in the links at the end. It's a project summary. It contains a project summary. It has a log frame. It has the goals, outcomes, outputs, activities, milestones, risk assumptions, all of those things. And then there is key performance indicators that will help you measure the progress of this program or a project. And then roles and responsibilities are outlined. Who is responsible? Who does what, when? And then the data flow. You gather information. How is that treated? How is this data collected? How is this treated? How is this analyzed? And that is data management, where do you store it, how secure you keep it, how do you analyze, all of that. And then you ultimately have the reporting side of MIT, which again, it could be periodic on a periodic basis. Now, this is the most crucial element of monitoring and evaluation, which is the development and use of what we call as KPIs, key performance indicators. They are actually tools. They are tools to measure the performance of a program towards its outcomes, or help track the progress of project activities towards their outputs. So it's very important. And this is the make or break of a project, in my opinion. If a key performance indicator is properly selected, then you can properly measure and you can properly identify how well the project is doing. So if the KPI is not properly selected, and this I see all the time in various projects, in the beginning, people are excited, there's all kinds of hopeful thinking about project success. So sometimes we don't pay full attention to the details of KPIs, but later on, as the project starts rolling, it comes back to haunt us. So it's very important to select high quality indicators, which are specific, SMART, you probably have come across this, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. And then each KPI and the right side small box, which is not really legible here, is something that you should look at. It has all the details, KPI, the definition, purpose, what's the target, the data collection approach, who is responsible for it, what is the measurement technology, methodology that you're going to use, quality control, reporting method, all of those things. And this is important to be developed for KPIs. So I'm almost done, last couple of slides. The project action planning comes after everything you're ready to implement. And this is where the rubber hits the road. You identify the activities, you identify what are the various tasks, who is going to lead it, who is going to be part of the team, what is the deadline. So you put all of these things together, and that becomes your action plan to implement the project. Documentation and reporting, again, proper documentation, as I mentioned, is crucial, and the results are integral part. Often there is a periodic progress report, which is quarterly, perhaps, or once in 6 months, to be decided. And those reports help the project managers to do the internal review. And then they can adapt the indicators, the project managers can adapt the indicators and targets as the intervention progresses based on what we are seeing in the M&E. But last slide really is that the cross-cutting, there are certain traps and pitfalls when you do M&E. Make sure that you keep in mind the cross-cutting matters, staff turnover, training and onboarding, consistency of performance across teams and cultures, especially when different countries are involved, change of project priorities, non-technical factors interfering in project implementation, war, strife, social tension, whatever. And then death by spreadsheet. It's easy to think that spreadsheet is the answer for all these data manipulation, data management of M&E, but it takes away the nuances. So be aware of that and make sure that any spreadsheet you use has the ability to capture your thoughts and nuances of that. And then you incorporate any of these risks in the M&E plan, how to mitigate them, and identify ahead of time how to overcome these challenges. Conclusion, what we learned so far is that M&E is an essential part of a program or project intervention. It's a systematic approach, and it is important to choose well-defined and high-quality key performance indicator. So, and documentation and reporting are integral part of the M&E process. But what happens when things don't work according to our plans? Suddenly there is an unexpected development. This is where our next speaker, Attila, comes in, and I'm eager to listen to his slides as well, his stories as well. And this slide gives you a complete list of hyperlinks of free and useful resources on M&E. Thank you very much for your time. Over to you, Mateus.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you so much for this comprehensive and effective presentation on the main concepts in terms of behind project monitoring and evaluation. Now I would like to introduce Attila, our next speaker, who will focus on the practical aspects of M&E. Atila Uras is UNEP Sudan Country Program Manager, supervising the country team in assisting the people of Sudan to achieve peace, recovery, and development on an environmentally sustainable basis. He has more than 20 years of experience on project management, environmental governance, policymaking, and sustainable development. Attila is a former coastal engineer who moved to the nonprofit world in 1999. Then he became a board member in several national and international NGOs and foundations. Taught integrated coastal zone management in the Middle East Technical University for more than 5 years. Attila started working at UN in 2006 as project manager at UNDP Turkey, and he later joined UNEP in 2012 as program officer to the Barcelona Convention Secretariat. Attila studied civil engineering at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey, and holds a master's degree on coastal engineering and coastal zone management. It is a privilege to us to have you, Attila. I'm sure we'll have a fruitful time learning more about practical aspects with case studies on M&E. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mateus. And listening to my background, I felt like I'm on very dry grounds now in Khartoum. And greetings to everyone from Sudan. I have a very unstable internet connection, so I'm showing my face now, but if you allow me, I will turn off my video to allow a proper bandwidth so that my connection will not be interrupted and I'll be able to share my presentation safely. So thank you very much for everyone for attending. And let me immediately share my screen and start our... Okay, so I hope you're able to see.
Yeah, we can see it well.
Okay, so then let me turn off my camera if I can. Yes. Okay. So thank you, Ravi, for setting the stage for me with all the theory, and I'll try to, in fact, transfer all this theory to practice, and you'll see what we lose in between. And by the way, also big thanks goes to the team who are behind the scenes to make this training happen, and highly appreciated. And but if we were here, having this gathering in a room, I would be able to have all my colleagues to me who contributed to this presentation, the ones who have, in fact, very strong hands-on experience from the ground and from all the projects that we have been carrying out. But luckily they are online, and if you have any detailed questions, they will interfere and they will join and answer the questions, I'm sure better than me. And as this is the last session of this series of webinars on project management, and you have seen many different project cycle approaches so far, I'd like to move to the next slide, hoping that this is going to remain in your minds, how we see a project with all the theory that we heard so far. According to Murphy's 6 phases of a project, the project is composed of enthusiasm, disillusionment, panic, search for the guilty, punishment of the innocent, and praise and honor for the non-participants. So this is reality, I can tell you. If we align this with the project cycle management that you have seen so far, the enthusiasm comes in the concept note and product. So with all the joy of the ideas being reflected to the document, you have all the enthusiasm. But when the time comes for the inception phase, you realize the disillusionment. How are we going to translate these things into action? And then in the implementation, the panic phase starts. And monitoring and evaluation, the subject of today, comes in when you try to find who is guilty and who is the person behind all this product. And then the final evaluation comes, which means punishment of the innocent. And then the project teams leave. And after 10 years, when somebody has the anniversary of the successful results of the project, then comes the time for the praise and honor of the non-participants. So you will also see the reflections of Murphy's 6 phases of a project in the coming slides when I refer to our field experience. But before also going to our experiences, I will draw a very quick picture of the kind of emergencies, crises, or conflicts, or the hardship that we are going through in Sudan, which is in fact the environment that we have around us to implement the projects, to try to do our work, to reach our outcomes or any product that we are trying to reach. So everything started in September 2018, and you're going to see many of these trouble that we experienced are like the ones that you put in your risk assessment in your projects as in different levels of likeliness to happen, like stable government. We woke up one day in September 2018, and there was no more Minister of Environment, which was our main counterpart, and we had to work with them. Like that was the rule. And then we had a period where the environmental governance structure in the country was very confusing and very complex, because there was a newly established National Council for the Environment, and there was the good old Higher Council for the Environment, and they both existed with some overlapping and conflicting mandates. Meanwhile, in December, mass protests start against poverty, corruption, unemployment, and those demonstrations lasted a couple of months. In April 2019, we have seen the era of al-Bashir finished, and al-Bashir was overthrown following the military coup on 11th April. So again, conflict or unstable government kind of risks were happening in those days. I mean, the things we put in our project documents were happening. In June 2019, there was a very bloody disbursement of a sit-in, which in fact triggered a lot of other bad experiences, let's call it like this. But there was no surrender by the people in the streets, and there was the March of Millions, 1st of July 2019, which paved the road towards the military factions to agree to share power with the civilians in a 3-year transition period. And happy days started with the Prime Minister on board, Prime Minister Hamdok, and huge programming, vision setting, and proper implementation of the programs. We were back on track. Then Corona days started in March 2020, which came with a lot of restrictions in field work and in our meetings with government counterparts, in our monitoring efforts, in any kind of project implementation action. It was impossible to implement, with a lot of new ways of working, new ways of living that we all experienced. And meanwhile, there was unrest in the streets despite Corona, and due to mainly economic crisis, very high inflation, there was an assassination attempt to Prime Minister Hamdok, but all those processes we were able to survive, we were able to adjust ourselves. You'll hear a bit more in the coming slides. And in October 2020, a very important peace agreement was signed. Everything was going quite well, but still the government was very fragile, because the new cabinet after the peace agreement had to include former rebel groups. Meanwhile, the Darfur states started seeing again an escalation of conflict, and that is still our project site. So we had to adjust ourselves according to those. And there is still 400% inflation, protests are going on, and many different challenges we kept seeing until 25th of October, where the military takeover took place. Armed forces detained civilian members of the ruling council, including also the prime minister. And then he was reinstated, but resigned in January. And then continuous demonstrations are still going on in the streets. And as the final hit, we had the Ukraine crisis. Sudan stood next to Russia, which was not welcomed by the Western world, who were and are providing humanitarian and development support, but now that the current program is unfortunately frozen. So under these circumstances, we are trying to implement the projects, carry out new programming, and also do our monitoring and evaluation work. So coming to the subject, I want to share our experiences in two different dimensions. At first, I want to talk about a soft project, a policy project, and what kind of challenges we faced and what the lessons learned are. And then I'm going to talk about our field projects, where the story is totally different with different challenges. And I will wrap up with some additional lessons learned. So our soft project was an influencing and advocacy project. It was aiming at enhancing knowledge, change of behaviors, attitudes, perception of climate change and environment. As you see, these are the enthusiasm part of Murphy's 6 phases of project. And it was implemented in a very complex, very dynamic, and continuously evolving context, as I described earlier in the previous slides. It was totally unpredictable. There were many competing interests of different counterparts, different beneficiaries. There were different motivations, different expectations. And when you have objectives of enhancing knowledge, changing behaviors, that change comes very slow. And the attribution to your interventions is contested. So that was a hard context that we were trying to work on. But meanwhile, we were trying to also follow the traditional ways, the traditional steps of monitoring at different levels, activity level, output level, and outcome and higher impact level. So in our soft project, the name was ADAPT. For the output level, we use UNEP's tools. So we have corporate tools for monitoring and reporting, online tools. Some of them are monthly, some of them are 6 monthly. And at outcome and higher impact level, it was our reporting to the donor, and there were proxy indicators and very enthusiastically set key performance indicators. So what were the challenges in all this experience of a soft project in Sudan? Well, Sudan was very much used to seeing humanitarian aid kind of projects. There was no soft project experience. They wanted to see activities, some buildings constructed, some dams constructed, or training programs organized, which we did. But that missing soft project experience created contradicting expectations of partners. Some government counterparts wanted to control the budget. Some wanted to have a word in some of the activities of the budget, so or the implementation. And there was, in fact, also another dimension was as we were not delivering activities on the ground, like other humanitarian or development projects, the influencing role of the project was not understood well by the partners. This was quite a challenge, and direct attribution of the changes to changes was like impossible. We were contributing, but very hard to show that in fact the achievements were attributing to the expected outcomes. There was very enthusiastically set KPIs, like number of people with improved resilience to environment and climate stresses. I mean, how can you measure this? You need to have maturation of effect, which is an important item when you're dealing with KPIs. So level of integration of climate change in national, sectorial, and institutional planning. When you don't have the institutions in a revolution context or a closed ministry, how are you going to measure this? Or extent to which interventions is likely to have transformational impact. I mean, how can you measure this in the lifespan of a project? These were the challenges we faced in implementation, but also in the monitoring of our projects. So what we did, how we handled, we discussed a lot with the donor. So we convinced the donor at a certain point that we drop, for example, the first KPI I referred to. Instead of direct attribution, we convinced them that we focus on contribution. Results may not be reached in the lifespan of a soft project. So demonstrating the likely trajectory of the achievements or the progress was another way of showing the donor how we evaluate the progress, how different we should interpret the milestones, and also the indicators. So we had a three-step theory-based approach, but it worked well in practice. So we had thematic case studies. It was a very complex project, so we have identified the themes of mainstreaming, water management, natural resource management, climate change, etc. We had different case studies. Then we synthesized these cases on outcome level results, indicators, and KPIs. And also for the course correction, the results reporting was used to support this course correction, this likeliness of the trajectory. And also we extracted the knowledge and shared the knowledge to satisfy the donor and also the government and the other counterparts on how the project is reaching its set objectives. Adaptive management was key and still key, not only for soft projects, but also for the field projects. So when we look at the typical approach of a project management, simplifying it as you see in the figure, this rolling wave planning, rolling wave approach in monitoring is very crucial to overcome the triple constraints. In every step, as we said, this entire project cycle management needs to be iterative. Then you do your monitoring at every step of your project cycle. This allows you to revisit the scope, your resources, and time, because sometimes time is not enough, sometimes it's too long, sometimes your beneficiaries change. Sometimes there are new and emerging areas of intervention where you need to bring in. Or sometimes your budget is not enough, or sometimes you have a lot of budget and you can't spend it. So that's why these triple constraint rolling wave planning was quite crucial. And when you have a proper iterative process, then this allows you to do adaptive management, which is in fact the only way to survive and to run projects in such a conflict context. Let me move quickly to the field projects, also considering the time to leave some space for questions and answers. So the context of our field projects are in a post-conflict setup, sometimes still available conflict. We try to do natural resources management, water resources management, climate change adaptation, a lot of environmental governance work. We work on livelihoods with communities to have climate resilient livelihoods. Meanwhile, we are creating dialogue platforms and contribute to peace building and more and more and more. So you can visit our website and see the details of our projects. Of course, as these are projects like soft projects, you more or less follow a similar level, similar different levels of monitoring, but your activity level monitoring has more challenges because when you're working with communities and on the ground, you have to have a lot of activity monitoring that which are going to feed the outputs to reach your outcomes. But what were the challenges? For example, during the former regime, the Humanitarian Aid Commission and the National Intelligence Services were not allowing us to go to the field. So it was impossible to have regular and planned monitoring visits. So you have to be very creative in collecting information from the ground. When the COVID restrictions started, of course, we were not able to go to the villages not to spread the virus. But meanwhile, we also have a lot of insecurity. So we have to have a lot of adaptive solutions to our monitoring and evaluation work. As I said, even though our work seemed to be improving livelihoods and natural resource management, there are so many peace building, trust building, and conflict resolution work that comes as fringe benefits next to that. So you can't avoid, you can't keep yourselves out of these processes while doing your business as usual. So these become at a certain point the central themes of UNEP interventions, especially in conflict areas. But it is very difficult to measure, very difficult to monitor, and very difficult to report. Another challenge that we currently see is the security situation in Darfur is bad, and we are required to move in convoys, but the peace-building mission is not there anymore. So we need to find the escorts from the local police and negotiate and convince them. And sometimes they ask for amazing prices to accompany the field missions, which may cost like $5,000 a day. And you don't have those funds because these were unplanned funds, of course, budgets for such cases. So these are few of the challenges that we are experiencing. But what are the solutions? What are some lessons learned, and what could be some inspiring recommendations for some of you who are actively engaged in fieldwork? So the team in North Darfur and also in the other parts of the country where we have our projects are very creative. So when there is no access to, for example, deliver the activities, the team came up with a solution of, for example, carrying out some community-targeted trainings by radio programs. So we worked with the local radio stations and managed to have quite good turnover of people who follow and reported back that it was a very successful approach for training. And meanwhile, when you have your key informants and local leaders already set, collection of information by phone was quite a widely used method that we had to apply. And also these phone contacts prior to field visits helped us to have real security checks, not to find ourselves in the middle of an armed clash or in a raiding, wrong time, wrong place. Sometimes we had to outsource the monitoring. There are quite strong networks of community-based organizations, especially in Darfur, and they provide vital support to access the field first and also collect data and baselines and report back to our monitoring and evaluation officers. We had to invest on the capacities of these networks, and but that was, I think, quite a good move for the sustainability of the projects after we. So as I said, the communities played a vital role. So you get the information from the communities. In conflict-affected areas, sometimes you bring in peace centers, which are under university setups, university structures. And when you, for example, use the capacities of these institutions to collect information from the ground, it helps, for example, when you are sending those people, instead of UN officials, they see locals, they see people that they know, who speak their languages, who speak their dialects, and it reduces the tension of some government security concerns, because you don't have internationals going to deep field to collect information. Some sensitive questions are better asked by the locals than UN officials, and then you will be able to get the answers. So these were the some of the institutes or partners that we used in collecting information for baselines, for further monitoring, and also for verifying some of the assumptions that we had at project design and implementation. But in summary, adaptive management is key when you're working in such emergency and conflict affected areas or post-conflict contexts, which needs to be fed very much by effective monitoring. It helps successful implementation, and it enables you to target the right groups and right amount of interventions, so you have higher positive impacts, and also timely and satisfactory reporting and fulfillment of the expectations of the donors and also your commitments. When we prepared this presentation, we realized one missing component of monitoring and evaluation, also project planning, which is, I believe, extremely important when you're working in conflict-affected areas and with conflict-affected communities, because these communities are very vulnerable and they are very fragile, very open for social impacts, unintended social impacts by project interventions. And similarly, also from the environmental perspective, even when you are having environmental projects, you may have unintended negative environmental impacts. This is quite likely. That's why it's very crucial to apply environmental and social safeguards from the very beginning of the project to strengthen the sustainability and the accountability of the programs and allow to respect human rights, protect people and environment from potential adverse impacts of your interventions, and also provide an effective channel for your beneficiaries to complain or to let you know any unintended social or environmental impact. As I said, these safeguards should be considered in the entire project cycle from identification to M&E. And it includes, screening, assessment, management. You will find a lot of information on these safeguards. There are many different standards and procedures or guidelines that you can use, including UNEP's own. But this is quite crucial. And additionally, the risk management plans from the very beginning of the projects and how to avoid or mitigate those these identified risks is very essential, and they have to be monitored very closely. And as I said, usually, I was happily putting all this copying and pasting these traditional risks in our project documents when I was working elsewhere. But I see that in Sudan, for example, or in any such conflict context, your risks are very likely to happen. And continuous screening and collection of data and information for the materialized risks or the progress of the risks and the evolvements, how they emerge, is very crucial. It has to be accompanied with implementation of the program and also implementation of mitigation and measures that you identified. And this is one of the most important aspects of adaptive management. You need to know your risks, how they are happening, how likely they are, in addition to all other monitoring and other, let's say, evaluation mechanisms that we have listed so far, either theoretical or practical. So I think I will stop here, and thanking to all of you. That will leave some time for questions and answers. And I will try my best, and I will also ask the colleagues, my colleagues' help in answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila, for your presentation. It's really great to see how much content and how comprehensive these two presentations could be, although you only had 60 minutes. So everything else can now be discussed in the Q&A session. And we already got some questions. So we would start with the first question to Ravi. Ronald Kombach is asking, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, is asking what are the approaches to be taken when M&E uncovers the need for accelerated or enhanced project implementation as a result of delays? So do you have any answer for that?
Sure, I'll make my comments, but I think this is probably better answered based on field experience by Attila. But my comments, this is a very common challenge that every project faced over the last couple of years because of the pandemic. So how, from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, the report that is submitted during this time identifies this risk and says, okay, well, for example, there's a project that I am involved in 5 different countries on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. People couldn't go to the field to actually implement. What do you do? So they identified this delay as a risk. How do we deal with it? So the creativity of the project manager based on the ground realities was taken into account. Things like instead of going to the field to do a review of monitoring review or evaluation, we did virtual missions using technology. And when people in the country teams couldn't go to the field to actually start implementing, for example, sapling, seedlings and whatnot, then they involved a government department locally to work so that they didn't have to travel. So they worked with the local community. So these were all the things that they did, that we did from where we were sitting, never going to the field, but we were looking at all the other options and speeding things up. And at the same time, changing our goals in terms of timelines, what to expect, and how this is going to impact the overall project. So to speed things up, we were able to modify our original plan and also keep the donor informed in terms of how to handle things. Attila, do you have anything to add there?
Yes, thanks. And you know, the line was a bit breaking, but I think we are talking about this MNE, if the MNE comes, the need for accelerated enhanced project management, right? So that's the question. Yes. Well, usually, I have to say, because nothing ever goes as planned, especially if you are in such a post-conflict or emergency context, and there are always delays. And what you need to do is, as also Ravi explained, you can do some prioritization, some agreement with your project partners, beneficiaries and the donors on revisiting doing a reality check on the remaining activities and how ambitious your targets or how realistic your expected outputs and outcomes are in that context. Usually MNE uncovers the need for when they realize the delays. Usually the recommendation comes to the donor to have a no-cost extension. So you always look for additional time that you can add also, but keeping in mind that there is no extension that is no cost. When you have an extension, at least the human resources costs remain, and that sometimes creates trouble on the donor side. But the most important thing is having really this continuous monitoring, not only leaving it to your obligatory compulsory reporting deadlines, but having this perhaps sometimes monthly overview of the reality check of your work plan to avoid those delays. But there are external factors like COVID, like a coup d'etat, like a flood, and these are sometimes your excuses to ask for that extension from the donor. But this is usually, I mean, you need to know the options, and depending on the case, you pick one of them.
Thanks, Attila, for your answer. Building up on this, we have a question from Zafi Demir, the question is, how do you coordinate with other UN agencies under these challenging conditions of project management?
I think that question is for me.
Yes, for you.
And I want to thank Zafer Demir for this question. He's joining from California, so that shows the global coverage of this event. Well, coordination with other UN agencies is crucial for wider impact, for sure, because even though there are some gray zones between the mandates of some of the UN agencies, usually with the proper partners, you can have easily quite a complementary structure, I would say, of these institutes coming together. For example, in one of our interventions in the Blue Nile state, we are trying to bring in natural resource management as a peace building, let's say, tool, while empowering the women. So with a lot of, let's say, gender dimensions, while improving the livelihoods of the communities and creating some, let's say, peace platforms. We work still very closely with UNDP, the development program, and also with UN Women. So the expertise that we bring on the table is the community environmental action planning. UNDP is coming with their capacity to translate their action plans into action, real action, targeting the communities. And UN Women is there to make sure that women play a strong role in the implementation of the action plan, taking into consideration their critical role in natural resource management in Sudan, and we create a model that can be replicated in other parts of the country, especially impacted by conflicts. So it is possible, but it's not easy. But especially under these challenging conditions, having UN agencies side by side is very positive, and it is the requirement by the member states of the UN. But the project management wise, especially having different administrative structures, when it comes to financial reporting, it becomes quite hell. That's a confession I have to make. To prepare the technical narrative reports, it's a matter of coordination, but when it comes to the administration, it's not easy. And but I don't know. I know Ravi has a lot of experience as well, so maybe he has things to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, we have time, so I can just add 1 or 2 sentences here. So from an M&E perspective, within UNEP or other UN agencies, it is a given that there will be interaction with other departments and whatnot. The key under such circumstance is in the project design itself. As you know, in a project, one of the major elements is stakeholder engagement. And so you would identify cross-cutting issues and the agencies, whether it's international agencies or government, local government agencies, identify them and how they are, how their mandates interfere or intersect. And then use that and already start engaging with them right at the project design time period. And then as the project progresses, there is periodic interactions depending on the urgency of the situation, whether it is a weekly meeting or once a month, but there are certain deliverables that the working group is created, and there is an actionable set of decisions that are made during this working group meetings, and then the progress is monitored. I'm talking about various agencies, organizations all coming together. So there is a single point of contact from each agency in this project that is identified. They come together on a regular basis within the working group. And so this type of thing happened. One of the recent examples that I was involved in was in St. Vincent and Grenadine. There was a volcanic eruption. And so there was a post-disaster recovery needs assessment that was being done with the international. UNDP was the lead organization, and the local departments were involved. And then they realized that the environmental cross-cutting aspects needed to be included to make sure that the environmental aspects impacts to be included in the PDNA, or the post-disaster needs assessment. So then they requested UNEP to get involved, and I was part of the working group, and I provided my comments from the environmental perspective, and they included that in their post-disaster needs assessment report. So that's an example of how sometimes during the project or after an incident, things that had not been thought about in the past comes up, and then immediately it is adapted, the response is adaptive, and they bring in other counterparts from other agencies. So being flexible is most crucial in this situation.
Thank you both for your answers. And yes, indeed, we have some time, so you can take your time answering the questions. We have another question concerning the practice of monitoring and evaluation. And I guess it's referring to the pitfalls shown by you, Ravi. So we have Mohammed asking, what are the major effects of culture in the M&E process, and how to assess it and act towards it?
Okay. This is a fantastic question, and it's a very practical one too. So often this type of cultural challenges happens when a particular program or a project spans larger than a particular area. If it's a single or multiple contaminated sites in one particular region, then it is less of a challenge because you only have to deal with the cultural aspects of one particular community or a particular region. But if it happens to be nationwide, then it's everywhere, and there are regional differences. And if it happens to be multi-country, then definitely is an issue. So if the question is about what are the cultural challenges that you face, right? Or how do you overcome it?
Like what are the major effects of the cultural differences and how to assess and to act,
okay.
to react.
So what are the major effects of cultural differences? For example, if you are working in several countries, one country is fairly liberal I'm using it loosely in terms of freedom of movement, men and women working in offices or field and all that. Whereas in another country, there are certain cultural norms, and that may mean that women hesitate to go to meetings or community events openly. Then, for example, that's a real life situation in terms of cultural sensitivity coming into play in a project. And so when that happens, already with your concept note and the intervention need and all that. So in the project design, stakeholder engagement is a major component, right? And so one of the risks to be identified is the cultural stresses and how would you deal with it. So you identify that risk, and then you come up with a mitigation method. So in the sense of a cultural aspect, it could be that you would go into an area where it is extremely different from where the project team would be involved in. If international experts such as myself would be going into a place like Ethiopia, southern part, where 99% of people follow the Islamic faith, and therefore they have a certain cultural practice of not having women come forward, and it's always led by the men. I have to be aware of that. I cannot. So there is a certain amount of training that is required to the international experts to be aware of that situation, and so that I'm going in there not thinking that my cultural background is sufficient. I have to be sensitized to the local cultural aspect as well. And then the other aspect, about money, accounting, we can see in Afghanistan, who is responsible where, what kind of accounting would you be able to demonstrate? Those kinds of things we have seen in Afghanistan when, in the Bamia region, for example, projects we have seen. So when these cultural aspects come into picture, you have to identify the risk, you have to see how we can mitigate, and that mitigation could be training, awareness, making sure that you provide some additional timeline things. And I'll give you an example of, I believe it is Sudan, Attila, you can confirm that, it may be before your time, that people planned an entire intervention, a project, and went to the field, and they found that community members refused to go because it was their harvesting season, and every able-bodied person had been pulled to the harvesting thing. So their entire planning, the project's planning, went unrealized because they didn't account for the rainy season, the harvesting season, the festive season, those kinds of things. So these are all cultural aspects, and one has to be really aware of it. Attila, if you want to add something on that.
I think it was in Sudan, but it wasn't UNEP, so I can't tell you that.
Okay.
So, but in fact, there is also a follow-up question probably linked to that, the culture. And well, this is something that we face in our daily lives, definitely, and especially in some of the interventions linked to conflict resolution. Because one thing is, of course, as Ravi said, for example, how to get information, get the data from the women of the community, because usually the meetings, for example, we just had very recently a monitoring and evaluation exercise of our Darfur project. When you have community meetings, it's usually under a big tree, under the shadow, and the women are sitting a bit behind the men who are sitting in the front. Noticing that, our evaluator, who is Egyptian, he also asked a separate meeting with the women. As he spoke Arabic, it was very easy for him to communicate, and extracted extremely important information from the women. And for example, that question, the following question from Mohammed El Hadi says, the major effects of Sudanese culture in our projects in Sudan. Well, for example, again, one of the reasons of conflict and the point to touch in our efforts in Darfur is to bring together the pastoralists and the farmers. Different uses, different cultures, different understanding of the issues. It was a big challenge, but our local teams managed to bring them all together around a large map that was covering the entire floor of a huge room, where they jointly discussed, with some heated, let's say, discussions at the beginning, which calmed down in time, thanks to the facilitation role played by our colleagues, that they started talking on the map, on where the water yard should be, how the migration routes are overlapping with the farms, and what could be the solutions, etc. So you have to take it into consideration. You should not go to the field to carry out field projects with your solution assumptions. That's why I put a lot of emphasis on our community environmental action planning exercises. Very important processes also to monitor if your assumptions initially for your project activities are realistic when it comes to the interpretation or elaboration of the situation by the locals. So that's where you bring in the local knowledge, how the problems are interpreted or understood, and from their perspective, what the solutions should be. And then you need to reflect it to your work plans, to your implementation. That is one of the keys for, I think, successful projects. So, you know, it is part of it. Sometimes it's unwritten, but this cultural dimension of monitoring and evaluation and the implementation of the project and all your activities, it is part of your daily routine.
And just shortly, there's another follow-up question for you. How will you overcome the situation you faced in Sudan? If you could just shortly give a hint, if you can overcome it, or because it's cultural differences, so I guess it's hard.
Well, if the reference is to the current situation that the country is in, I don't know who has the answer, but we keep our positive hopes, positive expectations high, and monitor the developments and try to stay relevant and continue contributing to the well-being of the Sudanese people. Because especially environmental problems, environmental issues or climate change do not choose what kind of government is there in a country or what kind of approach is there in a local community. So these are issues that needs to be tackled under every condition. That's why we also deliver such messages to the donor community in all our interventions with the government. And thanks to the hard work of the field teams, we continue under all these, let's say, hardship conditions to touch the lives of the local community. So I'm very thankful for that. But how to overcome the situation in Sudan? It's a multi-million-dollar question that everybody is trying to find an answer to.
Aika, can I add one thing, not about Sudan, but about cultural aspects?
Sure.
And this is true whether it's in Canada, America, or somewhere in Ethiopia, any place, doesn't matter. For project managers, this is key. Interpreting commitments from the other person. For example, you go to a project and through the project, you are having that stakeholder engagement with a department, government department or a community-based organization, and they will say, okay, I'll do it. Or okay, all right. That okay may mean something to you as a project manager, and you can walk away thinking that all right, things are in order, but that doesn't mean that that's what that person meant. And so each country, each society, we need to make sure that we are interpreting what they mean by, you know, in Hindi it says, ho jayega. It means, yeah, it'll be done. What does that mean? For a project manager, it is very challenging. Whereas if for locals, that interpretation is most important. So beware of that. That's one of the biggest challenge in terms of cultural sensitivity. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi, for this question, or for this answer. Also a bit, we were mentioning a bit before by Attila, the question of gender and cultural sensibility, how different countries approach this question. But there was a specific question to Attila, but I think I can also ask this for you, Ravi, and Attila can complement us, the role of women in the implementation of an action plan. Like,
Yes.
how do you, what is it specific about it? What is the specific gender question there?
Yeah, let me, probably the best answer will be our, how we approach to the situation or the role of women in natural resources management in our project in the Blue Nile state. Sustainable natural resources management provides quite important opportunity for women's economic empowerment. And in a context where some alternative livelihoods are needed, especially in a changing climate. That's why women has been, I mean, like the main target, and especially in the development of climate resilient and climate adaptive livelihoods. We are going to support them to organize economically through cooperatives, but not only for income gains. So it shouldn't be understood like we are focusing only the economic empowerment, but also the empowerment in the decision-making mechanisms in these governance structures that we are helping to establish from grassroots level to state level decision-making. And for example, in North Darfur, women now have are playing quite an important role in different levels of that governance structure, in the dam committees at village level, or having representation at the catchment management agency, which was established at North Darfur state level. But also when you enhance the resilience of women, that is very good for the stability of the entire communities. If you also provide platforms for the women of, for example, pastoralists and the farmers, that also creates quite good basis for social cohesion or peaceful coexistence. Women are very strong in Sudan. You know, they are, one anecdote, for example, in the establishment of a community forest in North Darfur, when we were discussing what changed, what speeded up the establishment of the forest, the woman, the leader of that woman group came and said that we took over because we saw that the men were not able to do it. So we just took over, and here it is. And it was she was really like waving the finger to the man, just watching us from behind. So in Sudan, women are strong, and targeting such projects, I think, is one of the keys of successful intervention.
Matthias, what is known, well recognized internationally, and it applies to every society, is that if you empower women, then the family unit is actually much more anchored compared to just empowering men in terms of training, awareness, resilience, or livelihood alternatives, and things like that. So that is why gender mainstreaming is an important component that is being focused on in many of our international projects. And so if you focus on helping, and I think that was the root of the original question, you know, why women? Why do you focus on women? That's because if we focus on women, we know that we are not only getting the awareness of that one person, but that entire family unit, and by extension, that entire community. And as Attila mentioned, you know, there's a lot of additional benefits that come, and therefore focusing on women through extra focus on women, I should say, is beneficial for the entire project and the the ability for that project to sustain itself long after the project duration is over increases, the probability increases. So there.
Thank you for this very comprehensive and insightful answer, both of you. I'm going to change the topic a bit, and we have a question from Sarbu Ghanem. This person is asking if there are any examples of how negative environmental impacts and crisis situations are mitigated. So if you could give examples for that. I don't know, maybe Attila, you want to start again?
Yes, of course. I mean, there are many efforts, for example, to mitigate the impact of peacekeeping operations, greening the blue helmets, and especially all the camp settings and dismantling of the camps, etc. So there are many examples. But I think one standard approach should be not to give up on your efforts to mitigate environmental impacts when there's a crisis. Because sometimes, of course, in a humanitarian development peace-building nexus line, your environmental efforts are mainly falling under the development. But when there's a crisis, when there's an emergency, the efforts move towards the humanitarian side. But even having the environmental impact of the humanitarian work mitigated and having less impact, this is something UNEP worked a lot on. We developed environmental markers. We work with humanitarian agencies, with OCHA, with World Food Programme, for example, to use proper bags for food so they are not going to remain in the environment and create additional pollution, etc. So there are several examples of it, and one of them in our soft project ADAPT, we work very closely with OCHA, and I think we reviewed something like 80, 90 projects or interventions of them with an environment lens, with a climate change lens, how those could be improved. So maybe Ravi also has some examples.
It's good. We can go on to the next question. I think you've covered it.
Okay, we got another question here. That's directed to Ravi by Baritone Elizabeth. In the situation where some local actors are resistant to interventions of a project manager, what would be the approach to settling this dispute? The question was thought with a focus on environmental, with like oil spill intervention.
Yeah, I know. And Baritone is saying hi from Port Harcourt region in Nigeria, I believe. Hello, I'm going there in 2 days, and looking forward to meeting people. The question about, look, from a UNEP's perspective, right? We do not have the ability nor the intent of engaging in extra funding for royalties and things like that in our project. And I know Attila can answer from his perspective. But in the project design, one of the elements that we have to make sure is properly covered is that we are engaging with well-established organizations, local organizations. We are engaging with those organizations that have proper, structure, organizational accountability, and all of those things. So in terms of when we engage locals internationally in some of the projects that I've been involved in, we don't directly engage communities. There is an intermediary, CSOs, civil society organizations who are well known, who have experience internationally. For example, we engaged CARE International or Cordaid or Wetlands International, who have local presence, local offices. We engage with them, and they have their relationship with local community-based organizations and local CSOs. And again, they have their rigorous review and whatnot. And that is the process that we follow in order to make sure that we are not ending up spending money on quote unquote royalties, So that's UNEP. We cannot engage in that kind of extra budgetary spending. Attila, what do you have? You're muted. Attila, you're muted. Yeah.
So when there's a dispute, I usually send the deputy or somebody else to solve it. No, the thing is, there is always resistance. You always find such local actors whose sometimes businesses or some operations might be impacted by your interventions. It requires patience. It requires a lot of consultations, bringing in other actors, other beneficiaries of your intervention to find a way to overcome such a dispute. We had one case in North Darfur. I'm not sure if Fleming is online, maybe he can also interfere at this point. But one of the diversion weirs, like a barrier that we put in front of the rainwater to have it spread in a wider area so that more agriculture can take place. One of the one farmer from the downstream who, for some reason, did not receive a lot of water in the previous years, thought that it was because of the diversion weir and destroyed a huge part of it, which caused additional erosion, further damage on the structure, etc. So to overcome this dispute, first we had some, of course, legal actions, brought in some top decision makers, but together with them, we also brought in the communities who are benefiting from that and who worked hands-on in the construction of that diversion weir, explaining it to the person that there are other reasons. So even if that weir is not there, water might not reach, and also finding a solution to bring water to that community as well. So it's just a matter of patience, consultations, bringing in other actors, and going with an attitude to provide a solution. That would be probably my answer. But there might be, I'm not sure if it is online, but there are such documents where such disputes are, in fact, documented, explained. The approach was also quite well articulated.
Thanks, Attila, for this answer. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to ask all the questions that were put on the chat. We're very thankful for everyone participating and for engaging with the Q&A. I think that was a very productive session. We would like to thank Ravishankar and Atila Uras for giving some of their precious time to conduct this last training session on the series Project Management During Emergencies. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. We will also like to thank all present here today and those who attended the last two sessions. We hope you're now more skilled in project management and how to adapt in times of crisis. A final note, we will receive your certificates after you have completed the post-training survey. They'll be circulated to your email accounts. I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you, Ike, for being my co-moderator. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone.
Thanks for the
Thank you.